So if you haven't already, I really recommend that prior to watching this video, you watch my video on planning and outlining an introduction. And then this video is predominantly aimed at better understanding the specific ways in which we write sentences in an introduction of a scientific paper. So I just pulled up a random paper. It's a well-written paper, but it's a fairly random paper. There was no rhyme or reason to why I chose this paper. It's not super unique in its writing style. I mean, it's a great writing style. I don't want to downplay the abilities of these authors. I actually don't personally know any of these authors. It's a paper that I use in a lot of my classes on honor and aggression. I cite this paper fairly frequently. But aside from that, you can do this activity with just about any paper that's well written. So this is a paper by Jennifer Boston and colleagues looking at precarious manhood and displays of physical aggression. And I just want to point out, because a lot of my students are oftentimes report that they don't know how to start writing their introduction or their paper. And I just want to kind of point out some key points about how introductions are written. So first off, I did discuss in that other video on sort of outlining your introduction that in the first paragraph of the paper, you should be giving the objective. And they're doing this, right? We propose that manhood relative to womanhood is defined as culturally as a precarious social status that can be lost fairly easily and thus requires continual active validation. We further propose that men understand, use, and even benefit from aggressive readiness as a means of validating. So the purpose of these studies is to test our idea about the link between precarious manhood and physical aggression. So again, I actually, when I pulled this paper up, again, I didn't choose this because it's a great demonstration of what I'm talking about. I chose it randomly because it's a paper that I've read before and I know it's a pretty good paper. But like I said in that other video, what you should do by the end, and usually it's about the last sentence, by the end of your first paragraph, you should be giving the objective of your paper. Now, that being said, I also said that you should hook your audience, and something that I think that they probably could have done a little bit better in this paper is having a little bit more of an engaging start. So they could have given some statistics about gender-based aggression and violence, and that probably would have been a little bit more attention-grabbing than what they have here to explain gender differences in the use of physical aggression. Gender role theorists often look to the content of gender roles, right? So it's a little bit of a boring start here, but no worries. It happens all the time. I have tons of papers starting like that as well. It's a fine start. There's nothing inherently wrong with this. It could have just been a little bit more exciting in the starting point. But what I really want to point out in this paper is how introduction sections are written. Once you get past this first paragraph, I just want to point out that almost every sentence can be essentially written as previous research has shown ... And I'm going to just read this paper with that in mind because, again, my students always say, like, I just don't know how to start. Well, the way that you start is just by thinking of previous research has shown, and then finish the sentence. Previous research has shown, finish the sentence. Previous research has shown, finish the sentence. And then you piece them all together. So here, previous research has shown, and I'm basically summarizing all of this. Previous research has shown, or previous research has portrayed manhood as a social status that is elusive and tenuous. Essentially the exact same phrasing there. Previous research has shown that the elusiveness of manhood lies in the fact that in many cultures the transition from boyhood to manhood is not a natural condition that comes blah, 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 right? Previous research has shown that compared to womanhood, manhood is often viewed as a status that is earned via passage of social rather than physical and biological milestones. Similarly, previous research has shown that the tenuousness of manhood lies in the fact that once earned, the status can be lost relatively easily via a host of social transgressions and shortcomings. For example, previous research has shown that when asked to explain how a person might lose his manhood, students at a large university, blah, blah, blah. So the reality of essentially any scientific paper is that every sentence basically says previous research has shown and then completes that thought. So what I always recommend to my students is that when you are getting ready to write a paper, you sit down and just write previous research has shown, and then you just fill this out. Have 100 of these sentences. Previous research has shown, if we're going off of the same example that I used in that other video when we were looking at true crime media consumption and perceptions of safety and support for criminal justice system, previous research has shown that, and by the way, I don't know if this is true quite yet. Ideally, at this point, I've done at least a literature search and started reading. But I realize for a lot of my students, this is a fairly new area of research for them. So my recommendation is before you quite start with what I have right here, you do a little bit of a lit search, and I recommend if a class asks you to cite 6 papers, I always recommend citing at least double that. So if you're in my class and I ask you to cite 6 papers in your introduction, cite 12. I always recommend that to people because it makes it look like you did more work, and you actually did do more work, because in order to cite a paper, you have to have read it. And so always, whenever a teacher says cite 6, double it. Your grade will be better and the paper will be better as a result of that. So if you're going to cite 12 papers, though, you probably need to have found at least 20, because you don't want to, and I actually think back to when I was an undergraduate student. If a teacher said you need to cite 6 papers in this introduction, you know what I did was I found 6 papers, and then I found a way to shoehorn them all in and make sure that I could cite all of them. But that's not the best way of writing a paper. The best way is not to do the first 6 sources that you found, but the best 6 sources that you found. So if a class asks you to cite 6 papers, again, I recommend citing 12, and that means that you probably need to find 20 to 30 and then pick the best ones to cite. So at this point, before you sit down and start writing this document, you should have probably found 20 to 30 citations and just downloaded those citations. You haven't read all of them yet, but just having found them, you probably have a pretty good idea of what's already out there. So you might have found something. By the way, I don't know this area, so I'm talking off the top of my head right now. This is just the research question that my students wanted to pursue, their research question was, again, how does consumption of true crime media relate to support for law enforcement, the criminal justice system, and perceived safety? Well, after doing my literature searching, I might have found that more true crime media consumption is associated with greater fear for personal safety. Well, that's one sentence down. I'd need to cite something for that, and I'd need to make sure that this is actually accurate. And probably at this point, if I found 20 to 30 sources, I probably know if that's somewhat accurate at this point. Again, before I cite something, I need to have read that thing. And it's not enough to just go with an AI summary of this thing or just reading the abstract. You need to have read the paper. Now, for my students, the reality is, at this point, I have been researching masculine honor and perceptions of aggression for a long time. Does that mean that I need to read cover to cover every paper that I cite? Probably not at this point. Most of the introductions, after you read a few of them in an area, all start to sound the same. So I can probably skip ahead to the objective, and as long as I understand the objective and what led to the hypotheses based on what I know about that area of research, I can probably start in on the methods section at that point. So very frequently, if I'm looking for citations and stuff like that, I skim the introduction, I read fully the current study overview, and then I start reading the methods and results, because that's what I'm citing that paper for. And actually, for a lot of my students, they get really confused. A lot of my students will ask me this question. So I'm just going to kind of pull back up that article that we were looking at there. And they'll say, like, maybe they were reading and they're like, oh, this idea right here, this is a really interesting concept that relates to my study. And they'll ask me, wait a second, do I cite this paper by Boston et al. in 2000, 2000, that's when was this paper published? What, 2009, that's what I was expecting there, is 2009. Do I cite this Boston et al. 2009 paper, or do I just go ahead and add in these citations because they are citing these other authors? You cite a paper for the ideas that are unique to them, meaning the theory that they generated or the study that they ran or the results that they found. We are not citing Boston et al. 2009 for this idea. This is them setting up their own study. And so if we wanted to cite this idea, one, we can't just copy in this sentence or this idea and then all of a sudden just pop these citations in there. That is not acceptable. You cannot do that. If you want to cite this idea, it's a great idea, you need to then go find these two papers, read them, comprehend them, and then cite them in the way that is most appropriate for your paper. So you can't just steal the citation and steal the idea from this paper. And again, we are not citing Boston et al. For this idea. What we cite Boston et al. For is the studies that they ran down here. That's what we're citing them for. We're citing them for their unique contribution, not what they are saying about previous research. So again, that is how we write our introductions. Again, the main idea is that when we write a paper, almost every sentence is in this form. And if you start, and sort of students ask me, how do I start writing? I have this writer's block. You just need about 50 of these sentences. And then you just need to order them and then start to think about how the sentences build from one to the other. And pretty soon you'll have an excellent introduction.